The rain fell hard on Washington that September night in 1939. Inside the White House, the lights of the Oval Office glowed softly through the storm. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sat alone at his desk, his cigarette burning low, the smoke curling upward in thin, uncertain spirals. Across the Atlantic, Europe was already in flames. Hitler's Germany had invaded Poland, and Britain and France had declared war. Roosevelt leaned over a pile of telegrams, his face tired but focused. "We'll stay out of it," he murmured, though even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. America wanted peace. The wounds of the First World War had not yet healed. More than 100,000 young Americans had died in muddy European fields 2 decades earlier, and the country had sworn never to repeat that mistake. The Great Depression had also left people exhausted, jobs were scarce, factories were silent, and the thought of another war felt unbearable. Congress had passed strict neutrality acts throughout the 1930s, forbidding the sale of weapons to any nation at war. Isolationist politicians, especially in the Midwest, thundered in rallies, "No more foreign entanglements." But Roosevelt saw what many Americans did not. He had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I, he had watched the last war end with promises of peace and democracy, promises that were now being shattered by dictators. Reports coming from Europe chilled him. Hitler had marched into Austria and Czechoslovakia, and now Poland. Mussolini in Italy had joined his side. In Asia, Japan was expanding its empire, brutalizing China and threatening Western colonies. Roosevelt realized that if America stayed completely detached, it might soon find itself surrounded by enemies on every side. Still, he had to tread carefully. If he moved too fast, the public and Congress would turn against him. The American people simply didn't want war. So, he began to act quietly, shaping policy through persuasion, speeches, and careful steps that edged the country closer to helping the Allies without openly defying the law. In one private meeting that autumn, he gathered his top advisors: Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, and a handful of military officers. A storm was raging outside, thunder rolled through the windows. Roosevelt, seated in his wheelchair, looked from face to face and said in his calm, patrician voice, "Gentlemen, if Britain falls, the world falls. And if the world falls, the oceans won't protect us." The men nodded grimly. They knew he was right, but they also knew that most of Congress didn't want to hear it. To buy time, Roosevelt came up with a legal maneuver, the cash and carry policy. Under this rule, America could sell supplies to countries at war, but only if they paid cash and transported the goods themselves. No American ships, no American soldiers, only goods. It was a loophole in the neutrality laws, and it allowed Roosevelt to help Britain and France without technically breaking the law. He sold food, oil, trucks, and even aircraft. Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain at first, and later Winston Churchill, both knew that Roosevelt was their lifeline. Meanwhile, the American press began to shift. Newsreels showed images of German tanks rolling through Poland, of burning villages, and of refugees streaming across Europe. Slowly, Americans began to feel sympathy for the victims and admiration for Britain, standing alone against the Nazi war machine. Still, when Roosevelt ran for an unprecedented third term in 1940, he promised, "Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." The crowd cheered. Deep inside, he knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. That same year, Roosevelt faced growing challenges. The Nazi blitzkrieg tore through France in a matter of weeks, and by June, Paris had fallen. Britain stood completely alone, its cities under nightly bombardment from the Luftwaffe. Churchill, now Prime Minister, sent desperate messages across the Atlantic. "Give us the tools," he pleaded, "and we will finish the job." Roosevelt was moved. In his private correspondence with Churchill, a quiet partnership began, one of the most important friendships of the century. But America still refused to enter the war. Isolationists, like aviator Charles Lindbergh, led massive rallies warning against involvement. The America First Committee had millions of members and argued that Europe's problems should stay in Europe. Roosevelt, knowing public opinion could not be forced, chose patience and strategy. He used the power of his voice, his famous fireside chats, to speak directly to the people. Sitting by their radios, millions of Americans listened as his calm voice explained why the world's fight for freedom mattered to them. He never said war. He said defense. He said duty. He said democracy. In one particularly memorable speech, Roosevelt described the United States as the arsenal of democracy. Factories that had once been silent during the Depression began humming again, producing weapons, ships, and planes not yet for American soldiers, but for those fighting tyranny overseas. The sound of machinery filled the nation's cities, workers returned to jobs, hope returned to homes. War production became an economic lifeline long before America officially joined the fight. Behind the scenes, Roosevelt also began preparing for the worst. He quietly strengthened the U.S. Navy, expanded the Army, and created new bases across the Atlantic. He ordered the construction of destroyers, submarines, and aircraft carriers. In 1940, he struck a crucial deal with Britain. The Destroyers for Bases Agreement. The U.S. would provide 50 aging American destroyers in exchange for access to British military bases around the world. It was another quiet step toward involvement and another example of Roosevelt's skill in balancing law, politics, and moral conviction. That winter, Washington was cold and tense. In the Oval Office, Roosevelt often sat late into the night reading reports, studying maps of Europe, tracing the advance of German armies with a pencil. He sometimes asked his naval aide to roll his wheelchair closer to the large globe in the corner of the room. Spinning it slowly, he would point to the Atlantic Ocean and say, "It's shrinking. Every month it gets smaller." He was referring to the reach of modern warfare submarines, planes, and missiles that could cross oceans. Isolation, he realized, was an illusion. By the end of 1940, the transformation had begun. America was not yet at war, but it was no longer truly neutral. The factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and New York were working day and night. Trains carried tanks to ports, shipyards built vessels faster than ever before. Roosevelt had maneuvered the country to the edge of the conflict not by force, but by faith that democracy must not die. On Christmas Eve of 1940, he delivered another radio address. His voice was steady, warm, and solemn. "The destiny of democracy is being decided today on the battlefields of Europe. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is no time for ease and comfort. It is a time to dare and endure." Millions listened in silence. Snow fell outside, covering American streets in quiet white. Across the ocean, Britain's cities burned under German bombs. And in the Oval Office, Franklin D. Roosevelt looked out into the winter night, knowing that America's days of neutrality were numbered and that the storm now raging across the Atlantic would soon reach his own shores. The Arsenal Awakens, 1940 to 1941. The world was closing in. By early 1941, Franklin D. Roosevelt could feel it in the very air of Washington, a weight pressing down from across the ocean. The reports on his desk told the same story each morning: London bombed again, thousands homeless, German submarines prowling the Atlantic, Hitler tightening his grip on Europe. Roosevelt's words from months earlier now haunted him: "If Britain falls, the world falls." And now, Britain was hanging by a thread. In the cold dawn of January, Roosevelt stood by his window in the White House, wrapped in a blanket against the winter chill. The city outside was still dark. He had barely slept. His wife, Eleanor, had stayed up with him for a while, reading letters from soldiers' families in Britain. One from a mother in Liverpool said simply, "We have nothing left but courage." He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his desk drawer. It reminded him why he could not stop. America still called itself neutral, but neutrality was now a performance, a mask worn to keep peace with public opinion. Behind that mask, the president was building the greatest military and industrial machine the world had ever seen. The Lend-Lease bill, introduced to Congress in January 1941, was his masterstroke. It allowed the United States to lend or lease weapons, ships, and raw materials to any nation whose defense was considered vital to America's own security. Roosevelt presented it not as charity, but as common sense. "Suppose your neighbor's house is on fire," he told reporters with a faint smile, "and you have a hose. Wouldn't you lend him the hose to help put out the fire rather than wait for the flames to reach your own home?" That simple metaphor disarmed his critics. Within weeks, the bill passed. And with it, the United States officially became the arsenal of democracy. Factories that had stood silent during the Depression now roared to life. Across the country, whistles blew, furnaces blazed, and assembly lines clattered with the sound of transformation. The automobile plants of Detroit began producing tanks and jeeps. In California, aircraft companies built planes by the thousands. Shipyards in Virginia and New York worked around the clock. The same industrial spirit that once built cars, radios, and refrigerators was now building the weapons of freedom. For many Americans, the change was personal. Millions found work for the first time in years. Women filled the factories, their hair tied back with scarves, their hands stained with oil and metal dust. Newspapers began printing stories of the girls behind the guns. The image of Rosie the Riveter, tough, confident, and patriotic, became the symbol of a new America. Meanwhile, in Europe, Winston Churchill was holding the line. The nightly bombings continued, but the British spirit did not break. Churchill's voice, crackling over radio waves, reached even American homes. "We shall never surrender." Roosevelt listened to those speeches with a quiet pride. Though the two men had never met in person, their letters had become a lifeline. They shared updates, frustrations, and even jokes. When Churchill worried that British credit was running out, Roosevelt wired back, "We have faith in you. The tools will come." The tools did come in convoys that crossed the dangerous Atlantic. But danger followed them. German submarines began attacking Allied shipping, and Roosevelt ordered American destroyers to patrol the seas. Though the U.S. was not officially at war, its Navy was already fighting a shadow battle beneath the waves. In September 1941, the destroyer USS Greer exchanged fire with a German U-boat. The incident marked a turning point. Roosevelt went on radio and told Americans bluntly, "When you see a rattlesnake poised to strike, you do not wait until he has struck before you crush him." The message was clear: America's patience had limits. That autumn, Roosevelt invited Churchill to meet him in secret off the coast of Newfoundland. They met aboard the British battleship Prince of Wales and the American cruiser Augusta. The two leaders, surrounded by the cold Atlantic, talked for days. They prayed together, ate simple meals, and drafted what would later be called the Atlantic Charter, a statement of shared ideals for the world after the war: no territorial conquest, self-determination for nations, freedom of trade, and an end to tyranny. It was a vision of peace in a time of darkness. When the document was made public, it inspired millions. For the first time, the world began to imagine what victory might look like. Back home, Roosevelt's political battles continued. Isolationists accused him of dragging the nation toward war. The America First Committee held huge rallies, claiming that Roosevelt was betraying his own people for Britain's sake. "Not one American boy for another European war," they shouted. Roosevelt rarely responded directly. Instead, he focused on preparing for what he already knew was coming. He expanded the draft, increased the size of the army, and pushed for massive naval construction. Quietly, he ordered the Navy to escort Allied convoys halfway across the Atlantic. The line between neutrality and war was fading fast. The president's health, however, was beginning to show strain. Long nights, heavy decisions, and constant worry wore him down. But his resolve only grew stronger. Sometimes, after midnight, he would roll his wheelchair to the map room, a small space deep in the White House lined with charts and red pins marking battle fronts. He would stare at the lines showing the German advance and mutter to himself, "We'll have to stop them. One day, we will." By late 1941, the world seemed on the brink. Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union, and Japanese expansion in Asia had reached the borders of British and American interests. Roosevelt's advisors warned that Japan might strike if tensions rose further. The US responded by freezing Japanese assets and halting oil exports, hoping economic pressure would stop their aggression. But far from backing down, Tokyo grew more determined. In those tense weeks, Roosevelt's speeches carried a mix of hope and warning. In one of his fireside chats, he told the nation, "We Americans are not blind to danger. We are building up our defenses, we are preparing, and we are united." He did not know that within months, danger would come crashing down in the Pacific. As autumn turned to winter, Washington glittered with holiday lights, but the mood was uneasy. Soldiers trained in camps across the South, shipyards buzzed night and day. The machinery of war was awake now, loud, relentless, unstoppable. Roosevelt had done what no president before him had dared. He had turned the power of American industry into a weapon of defense before the nation even fired a shot. On the night of December 6, 1941, Roosevelt went to bed later than usual. He had spent the evening reviewing a report about Japanese negotiations talks that seemed to be going nowhere. Before turning off his lamp, he scribbled a note in his diary, "The world's situation is critical. No telling what the next few days will bring." The next morning, as he sat down to lunch, the phone rang. An aide's voice came through, trembling, "Mr. President, we've just been attacked. Pearl Harbor. Hawaii. The whole fleet." Roosevelt froze, the room spinning for a moment around him. The arsenal of democracy had awakened, and now, it would have to fight. The Attack and the Awakening, 1941. The dawn broke gently over the Hawaiian island of Oahu on December 7, 1941. The sun rose over calm, turquoise waters, palm trees swayed in the morning breeze, and life seemed peaceful. But beneath that serene sky, a storm was gathering, a storm that would shatter America's isolation forever. At Pearl Harbor, the largest U.S. naval base in the Pacific, sailors were waking from their slumber. Ships rested quietly at their moorings, some undergoing maintenance, others preparing for routine drills. Few could have guessed that within hours, the skies would erupt with the thunder of Japanese warplanes, raining destruction and death. Just before 8 a.m., radar operators spotted a large formation of aircraft approaching. But their warnings were dismissed, believed to be American planes returning from a training exercise. Suddenly, without warning, Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes struck. Explosions ripped through battleships, smoke billowed skyward, and the deafening roar of anti-aircraft guns filled the air. The surprise attack was swift and devastating. The USS Arizona exploded in a massive fireball, sinking with hundreds trapped inside. Other battleships, like the USS Oklahoma and USS West Virginia, were badly damaged or sunk. Nearly 2,400 American servicemen and civilians lost their lives that day. Back in Washington, the news came like a shockwave. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was in the White House when the first reports arrived. His face, usually calm and composed, tightened with grim determination. The attack was more than a military strike, it was a declaration of war, an assault on America's very soul. That evening, Roosevelt sat at his desk, drafting what would become one of the most famous speeches in American history. With steady hands and a resolute voice, he addressed a joint session of Congress the next day, calling December 7 a date which will live in infamy. His words echoed across radios and newspapers. Asterisk yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Asterisk. The speech was short but powerful. Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan, a request met with near unanimous approval. America was no longer a spectator, it was a combatant in the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen. The attack on Pearl Harbor united the country like never before. Isolationists who had fiercely opposed involvement in the war now rallied behind the president. Factories that had been building weapons for the Allies switched immediately to full wartime production. Men and women enlisted by the thousands. The nation's spirit surged with a fierce determination to fight back. Meanwhile, Germany and Italy, allies of Japan, declared war on the United States just days later. Roosevelt's words in his address to Congress rang true. The world was now truly at war, and America stood at its center. Mobilizing for a two-front war was a colossal challenge. The government transformed overnight. The War Production Board was created to coordinate industry, allocate raw materials, and speed up manufacturing. Millions of Americans changed jobs or moved to new cities to support the war effort. The nation's economy, already recovering, now boomed like never before. The draft brought millions of young men into uniform. Basic training camps sprang up across the country, turning civilians into soldiers ready for battle. The military expanded rapidly, creating new divisions and training programs. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on roles in factories, shipyards, and offices. The famous image of Rosie the Riveter symbolized this new generation of patriotic workers. On the battlefields, American troops faced harsh realities. The Pacific Campaign was brutal jungle warfare, island hopping, and fierce resistance from Japanese forces tested their courage and endurance. In Europe, American soldiers prepared to join their British and Soviet allies against Hitler's forces. Throughout it all, Roosevelt remained a steady presence. Despite his declining health, he traveled across the country to visit troops and factories, delivering speeches that lifted morale. His fireside chats now carried a new urgency, a call to sacrifice, unity, and unwavering resolve. The war demanded more than weapons, it demanded belief. Roosevelt reminded Americans why they fought: to defend freedom, democracy, and the future of the world. His leadership helped transform fear into hope, despair into determination. As 1942 unfolded, America's full power began to be felt on the global stage. New ships launched, new planes soared, and new armies marched. The United States was no longer the neutral nation of years before. It had awakened fierce, determined, and ready to shape the course of history. The road to victory, 1942 to 1945. The year 1942 dawned with a grim resolve. America was fully mobilized for war, its factories humming with relentless energy and its young men deployed across the world's most brutal battlefields. The attack on Pearl Harbor had shaken the nation awake, but now the true test of American strength had begun. From the shores of the Pacific to the beaches of Normandy, American soldiers, sailors, and airmen faced enemies as fierce as any in history. The war demanded innovation, courage, and sacrifice on a scale the world had never seen. And the United States, once reluctant to join the fight, had become the indispensable force in the Allied victory. In the Pacific theater, the battle against Japan was brutal and unforgiving. The strategy was clear: island hopping. Rather than attacking every Japanese stronghold, American forces targeted key islands, slowly advancing closer to Japan's mainland. Battles like Guadalcanal, Midway, and Iwo Jima became symbols of intense struggle and heroism. Each victory came at a terrible cost, but it brought the Allies one step closer to ending the war in the Pacific. Midway, in June 1942, marked a turning point. The U.S. Navy, though outnumbered, decisively defeated the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 aircraft carriers and shifting the balance of naval power. This victory prevented Japan from expanding further into the Pacific and gave America the momentum it desperately needed. In Europe, the fight was no less fierce. After months of intense preparation, June 6, 1944, arrived D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. On the beaches of Normandy, American, British, and Canadian forces stormed German defenses under heavy fire. The landings were costly, with thousands killed or wounded, but the foothold was secured. From there, the Allies pushed into Nazi-occupied France, liberating towns and cities as they advanced. Inside Germany, the fighting grew desperate. The Battle of the Bulge, in the winter of 1944, was Hitler's last major offensive. American troops held their ground in freezing conditions, repelling the German assault and paving the way for the final Allied push into the heart of Europe. Back home, the war effort unified the country. Rationing, war bonds, and volunteer drives became part of daily life. Families coped with the absence of fathers and sons, and communities supported returning veterans with gratitude and pride. The war had changed America socially, economically, and politically, setting the stage for its emergence as a global superpower. At the helm, President Roosevelt continued to lead with vision and determination, despite his failing health. He forged close alliances with British Prime Minister Churchill and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, forming the Grand Alliance that would defeat the Axis powers. These relationships were complicated by ideological differences, but the shared goal of victory held them together. In April 1945, Roosevelt's death stunned the nation. Vice President Harry S. Truman assumed the presidency, inheriting the final and most challenging phase of the war. Truman quickly stepped into leadership, overseeing the conclusion of the European conflict and the decision to use a new and terrible weapon, the atomic bomb. In May 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. But the Pacific War raged on. The decision to drop atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 shocked the world and forced Japan's surrender days later, finally bringing an end to the global conflict. The cost of victory was staggering. Millions had died, cities lay in ruins, and the world was forever changed. But the United States emerged as a beacon of hope and strength, its economy booming and its military unmatched. Roosevelt's vision of a post-war world led to the creation of the United Nations, designed to prevent future conflicts and promote peace. The Marshall Plan would soon rebuild Europe, and America would commit to defending democracy around the globe during the Cold War that followed. The war had reshaped not just borders, but ideas about freedom, responsibility, and global leadership. Looking back, the journey from neutrality to total war revealed the courage of a nation willing to confront its fears and stand for its values. Roosevelt's leadership had prepared America for its role on the world stage, and the sacrifices of millions had secured a future where freedom could endure. The road to victory was long and hard, but it was a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the power of unity in the face of darkness.